Hi everyone, my name is Denzell, and today I'll be talking about something that I feel rather strongly about. It's the role of colonisation in humanitarian disaster and decolonising education. Now, I know that's a big title, but it's also a big conversation that needs to be had, because when we talk about colonisation, we're not just talking about the past, we're also talking about the systems and inequalities that still shape our world today. And when we talk about education, we're also talking about one of the most powerful tools that we have, either to keep repeating those colonial patterns or to break them. So in the next 15 or 20 minutes, I want to unpack what colonisation has meant and what it still means today for communities, especially here in Australia. I'll also explore how education can move beyond being part of the problem and instead become part of the solution, a space for healing, justice, and transformation. That's where we're heading, so let's get started. Let's start with the hard truth. Colonisation didn't end. It's not locked away in the past, and the effects are still visible everywhere we look today. Think about this as well. More than 80% of Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander languages are now endangered. Imagine what it means not just to lose a language, but the stories that come with it, the worldview, and the connection to country carried in every word. And the health outcomes are just as confronting. Indigenous Australians, on average, live 8 less years than non-Indigenous Australians. When we hear numbers like that, they can feel sort of abstract. But behind every statistic is a family. There's a community, a child growing up with fewer chances than they actually deserve. This isn't just history, it's happening right now. And education, for better or for worse, is right at the centre of it. So why does this matter for us as people training to work in education? It's because education is recognised as a fundamental human right in the UN's Declaration of Human Rights. It's supposed to empower and to lift people up. But colonisation disrupted that right. It broke down systems of cultural learning, it severed ties to land, and it left communities dealing with intergenerational trauma. And even today, we see those inequalities. In schools, whether it's lower Year 12 completion rates, underfunded programs, or fewer opportunities for Indigenous students. If we claim to value education as a human right, then we can't just keep teaching in the same ways. We have to look at how colonisation continues to shape what education looks like. And then we have to ask ourselves, how do we change that? Before we go any further, we should get clear on some key ideas. When I say colonisation, I don't just mean British ships arriving in 1788. I mean the ongoing systems of control over land, over people, over knowledge that are still persisting today. A humanitarian disaster doesn't only mean a natural disaster like a cyclone or a hurricane. It can also mean generations of poverty, dislocation and inequality caused by colonisation. For many Indigenous Australians, that's exactly what it feels like, a slow, ongoing disaster. And decolonising education, that's the big one. It means shifting away from seeing Western knowledge as the only valid form of learning, and instead centering Indigenous voices, languages, and worldviews. It's not a token gesture either, it's a complete rethinking of how classrooms work and who gets to decide what knowledge matters. Let's step back into history for just a moment. In 1788, the British invasion began, what we now call settlement. But for First Nations people, it meant dispossession. Land wasn't just taken, it was fenced, it was farmed, and claimed under a doctrine of terra nullius that denied Indigenous existence altogether. The so-called Protection Acts forced Indigenous people into reserves, cutting them off from country and their community. And perhaps one of the most devastating legacies was the stolen generations. Around 1 in 3 Indigenous children were removed from their families, placed in institutions or with non-Indigenous families, with the aim of assimilation. Education was used here as a weapon, to strip away language, to replace culture with the European norms. And while we talk about these things as history, the trauma and disconnection ripple forward into today's classrooms. This is the backdrop to everything we're discussing. If we frame colonisation honestly, it is nothing less than a humanitarian disaster. Its effects are still seen in health, in economics, and in education. Indigenous Australians face higher infant mortality rates, more chronic illnesses, and an overall poverty rate that's 3 times higher than the non-Indigenous population of Australia. And in education, the gap is just as visible. Year 12 attainment rates are around 30% lower for Indigenous students. These aren't just numbers, they're evidence that colonisation wasn't a one-off event. It built systems that still disadvantage people today. And when we see those inequalities in schools, we have to ask, is education part of the solution, or is it still a part of the problem? This leads us, unfortunately, to an uncomfortable truth, that education itself was a tool of colonisation. Schools enforced English-only policies, erasing Indigenous languages and pushing many to the brink of extinction. The curriculum actively silenced Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander histories, or even worse, they portrayed them in racist or stereotypical ways. Instead of being spaces of empowerment, schools were often spaces of assimilation. For many families, education meant being punished for speaking your own language, or being taught that your culture was flat out inferior. That legacy doesn't just disappear easily, and it's why decolonisation education today is not optional, but it's urgent. So how do we start to actually rethink education? This is where theory can guide us. Paulo Freire argued that education should be about liberation, not just control. Not just filling empty vessels with knowledge, but actually giving learners the tools to question and transform their world. Raewyn Connell reminds us as well that global schooling systems are still shaped by colonial power, often valuing Western knowledge above all else. And Linda Tawai Smith, a Maori scholar, challenges us to see that knowledge itself isn't neutral. Research, education, curricula, they've all been used in the past to exploit Indigenous peoples. Her work pushes us to flip that narrative, to ensure knowledge serves Indigenous peoples instead. These ideas aren't just abstract theory though. They give us a critical lens for reimagining what schools could be. We're already seeing what this can look like in practice. At Yirrkala School in Arnhem Land, bilingual, community-led education means kids grow up fluent in both Yolngu Matha and in English. It shows that learning in your first language doesn't hold you back. It actually makes you rather stronger. In Cape York, Noel Pearson's Cape York Academy is rethinking curriculum so that Indigenous-led content sits at the centre, not just the margins. And nationally, the Australian curriculum now requires teaching of Indigenous histories and its cultures. Is it perfect? No, but it is progress, and it shows what's possible when Indigenous voices lead from the front. These case studies remind us that decolonising education isn't like a fantasy. It's actually happening, and it's actually working. There are also organisations we can lean on for guidance and resources. Reconciliation Australia provides reconciliation action plans and school resources that give teachers practical strategies. AIA-TSIS, or ATSIS, they house archives of Indigenous languages, knowledge and research. It's an incredible tool for educators who want to bring authentic voices into the classroom. Globally, organisations like Concern Worldwide show us how education in humanitarian crises often overlap with the legacies of colonisation. And of course, the UN Declaration of the Rights of Indigenous Peoples lays out a global standard. Indigenous peoples have the right to design and control their own education. Together, these groups gives us both inspiration and practical tools to bring decolonising ideas into the classrooms. So, what does this mean for us as future teachers? First, let's teach with Indigenous authored books and texts. Representation on matters, but authentic voices matter even more. Second, let's invite elders and community leaders into the classrooms. It's not just guest speaking, it's a way of rooting education in community, culture, and in lived experience. Third, we've got to challenge colonial narratives. Don't just accept the textbook version of Australian history. Give students the tools to see whose stories are missing. And finally, let's empower students to think critically and to act. Decolonising classrooms is not just about ticking boxes, it's about shifting power. And students, Indigenous and non-Indigenous alike, need to see that they can be a part of that shift. Now, I won't sugarcoat this next part. There are definitely challenges to this. There's political pushback, especially in today's so-called culture wars, where including Indigenous perspectives in curriculum somehow gets treated as controversial. There's also the danger of tokenism. Just throwing in a Dreamtime story or a dot painting without engaging with deeper cultural knowledge, that's just not going to cut it. And there's the reality that many teachers don't feel confident within themselves. You know, they want to do the right thing, but they haven't had the training, or they worry about, getting it wrong. But here's the thing. Those barriers can't stop us. They should really be motivating us, because if we're serious about human rights in education, then this is exactly the work that we need to do. If there's one thing I hope you take away from today, it's this. Education is never neutral. It either reinforces the systems we've inherited, or it helps us reimagine them. And right now, those systems are still deeply shaped by colonisation. When Indigenous students walk into a classroom, they don't walk in alone. They carry with them generations of resilience, but also the weight of stolen land, lost languages, and interrupted learning traditions. If our classrooms ignore that, if they keep teaching a narrow version of history or a one-size-fits-all curriculum, then education becomes part of the problem. But it doesn't have to be that way. Education can be a site of transformation. It can be where students see themselves reflected, respected, and empowered. It can be where all Indigenous and non-Indigenous learn to tell a fuller story of this country. One that doesn't erase voices, but honours them. Decolonising education isn't just about ticking boxes or following policy. It's about courage. It's about choosing to centre Indigenous knowledge, even when it's uncomfortable, or even when it challenges us. Because that's what real learning does. It unsettles us, it pushes us, and it changes us. And honestly, that's why this means so much to me. Because if we get this right, we're not just teaching facts and skills. We're part of the healing. We're building classrooms that don't just prepare students for exams, but prepare them to live in a society that values justice, equality, and the truth. So my takeaway from all of this is this. Every choice we make as educators either repeats the legacy of colonisation or helps undo it. And if education really is a human right, then we can't afford to sit on the sidelines. We have to be a part of the change. That's the challenge I want to leave you with. What kind of classrooms do you want to create? Because for me at least, the answer is clear. Ones that don't just teach knowledge, but ones that give power back where it's been taken for far too long. Thank you for watching, and I hope you enjoyed.